Hello, everyone in the room. Good morning to those joining us here today in Victoria, and perhaps good afternoon to anyone joining us virtually today. So I am here with Dean Sutton, who I will allow to introduce himself in just a little bit. And together we're going to talk to you about managing metadata and some lessons that we've learned from our perspectives within the public sector. This is all right, let's try it this way.
Clicker's not working.
Yeah.
Of course it's not.
We did test this just a few minutes ago.
There you go.
Thank you. So just to begin, to introduce myself, my name is Marissa Perrin. I'm an analyst on the Information and Data Governance Policy and Legislation team within the Data and Digital Policy sector of the Office of the Chief Information Officer of Canada within the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. So I represent the Government of Canada. Again, I will let my fellow panelist introduce himself in a moment, but we're here today to provide you with an overview of the policy approaches to metadata that were adopted by each of our respective jurisdictions, so the Government of Canada in my case, and the Government of British Columbia in Dean's case, and the approaches that we took in view of information and data governance priorities. And we're hoping that today will be insightful to you as members of the open data community, because we want to share with you the policy options that we've each pursued, the methodologies that we use to do so, and provide you with some of the lessons that we learned in our positions as public sector representatives. Oh, I know I'm going the wrong way. So in order to tell this story today, first of all, when Dean and I were first approached to speak together about our respective stories and our journeys in metadata policy development, we realized that despite the fact that maybe the information technology solutions might look different and the policy landscapes might vary a little bit, ultimately a lot of the challenges that we were facing were obviously very similar, and the benefits that we each stood to gain in establishing metadata policy were pretty much the same. And so we agreed that we would tell our stories in tandem, so it won't just be me, you're hearing from me for the first half and then Dean from the second half, but we will be telling our stories alongside one another, because we hope that this will give you an additional way to compare and contrast our experiences, our findings, and the solutions that we pursued. And in order to tell our story, we also decided that we would draw a little inspiration from the topic itself, from metadata. And so we've outlined our plot line basically speaks to the who behind these policy development initiatives, why we did them, when we did them, because timing is everything, how we undertook our respective projects, what we ended up with, and then finally addressing the big question of where does this leave us? Okay, so starting off with the who. This is where we're each going to take an opportunity to delve a little bit further into our own individual experiences with metadata, the relationship that we had walking into our respective experiences, because it's really hard to gauge the lessons that you've learned and if you've made any progress if you don't fully understand where you started. And so a little bit about me. Yes, I work as an analyst right now. I develop policy, that's my main role, but I actually started in the government about 20 years ago and held various positions within different program areas. I worked as a clerk, I did administrative work, I was a research officer, and my awareness of what metadata was, or even the existence of the word, was pretty much non-existent. Information management was a means to an end for me. It was a successful, day of managing information if I assigned a file name to my digital files that allowed me to find the work that I had done again. if I was able to share it with my colleagues. And other than that, I made really active use of a file classification code 999, which was basically, we'll get to that later, haven't decided what the actual subject is or where this fits in. And I would file them away and just trust that myself and my immediate colleagues could find everything again. Well, fast forward a few years, and then my role changed, and I became a government records archivist working for Library and Archives Canada. And all of a sudden, information management became the focus of my day. I became a practitioner overnight, and suddenly I had to abide by the Canadian rules for archival description. And I was absolutely desperate for information from Government of Canada institutions for details on the context of creation of records, organizational information, dates, times, locations of where things were created, etc. And on top of it, I had a big, thick rule book, because I did have a hard copy. I even took a night course in archival arrangement and description. I became extremely dependent on metadata, and it became a preoccupation of mine. And you would think that, well, you have all these, well-articulated, elaborate rules for describing records that, this should make, put the Government of Canada way ahead of the game in terms of understanding the information assets that it had in its records. However, then you introduce the other aspect of my job, which wasn't just to understand records for the purpose of appraisal and description, but to facilitate access by users. And that could include departmental researchers or, of course, the public. And suddenly I realized where user behavior, where terminology that might, or subjects, vocabularies that might make sense to someone outside of a government records archivist or someone in the archival community really bumps up against other standards. And I had limited capacity to influence this process. So fast forward, again, my role shifts, and suddenly I find myself in a position developing policy, analyzing policy challenges and trying to come up with solutions. And I thought, well, this is great. I mean, when it comes to describing records, unstructured data, boom, I've got this. I understand metadata, I know how it functions, I know what needs to be done, but then lo and behold, you throw data into the mix. And I am not a data practitioner, and my background is not in managing data, but suddenly this became part of the problem that I had to solve. And using metadata in order to ensure data-related concerns like reproducibility of data down the line suddenly became of great interest to me. So I humbly embarked on this experience working on a new metadata policy direction for the Government of Canada based on that background.
Thanks, Marissa. So my name is Dean Sutton. I'm a manager at the Strategic Policy and Legislation Branch in the Office of the Chief Information Officer, Ministry of Citizen Services, Government of British Columbia. Our branch is the Central Policy and Legislation Workshop for the ministry, and working on many strategic policy and legislative initiatives. I'm also the chair of the ICT Policy Community of Practice. So that's a subgroup of the, Public Sector Chief Information Officer Council, thank you. So that's a joint council across Canada, and the Community of Practice is a subgroup of that. I chair that group, and I'm fortunate in a way because I get to meet and talk to a lot of policy wonks across Canada on various emerging issues and trends that are going on. I also refer to myself kind of as a generalist, kind of a jack of all trades in the information management and data management world. Master of none, I will make note of that. I basically know enough to get myself in trouble, which does happen from occasion. I really rely on the experts in the various fields and disciplines that I engage with, so from privacy, security, data management, procurement, etc. They really are the ones that help me work on the products that I work on, and we support each other in our overall digital transformation journey together. Now that I gave you a little bit about me, without going into too much detail, with all that said and under that umbrella, a few years ago, in 2017, 2018, I was approached to develop a new standard. This standard addressed metadata. So there was some work being done in another branch on auto classification, and there were some other branches working on some products that required some sort of metadata type standard. Of course, I nodded my head, and when they asked, do you know anything about metadata? And I said, yes, of course I do. I know all this stuff about metadata. I knew nothing about metadata. It was pretty foreign to me at the time. But having already said yes and jumping off that metadata bridge, so to speak, I figured I could tackle this topic through my network of folks that I have some relationships with, and we could help fill my knowledge gap in as we moved along. I was really just happy to be working on a new standard. You don't always get a chance to work on something new. A new standard that would help promote our digital transformation and improve our services and information sharing within the government. So that was really the key driving factor for me to move forward in developing this new standard. The why. We can jump to the next one, really. So we thought to level set a bit about metadata, and in case it's a foreign word to you today as it was to me a few years ago. You can kind of look at the slide, gives you some context there. But metadata literally is data about data. It provides information about other data, and it helps make our digital world organized and accessible. In a sports context, just because I'm a sports person, I like to get into some sort of analogy when I can, metadata is the workhorse of the data team. It rarely gets any recognition. If you ever worked in metadata, you'll probably recognize that. But it's a value part of the ecosystem nonetheless, kind of like a Southsea or a Chronic with the Vancouver Canucks. If you're a Vancouver Canucks fan, which many people are these days just because they're having an astounding season so far. Some examples in everyday life that you've probably encountered metadata. So have you ever taken a photograph and the date, location, and the camera settings related to that photo? So if you're on your socials and you take a picture and you tag location, like you're in Hawaii, I was just in Hawaii, that's why I said that. You're using metadata to do that. In a library context, like Marissa said, you have your title, author, publication date. If you ever sourced a paper in university, you probably use metadata to do that. In the music context, if you're on Spotify and you're searching for some sort of piece of music, so you have your artist, your album, and your genre, those are all pieces of metadata to help you find that search. And then in any search engine that you use today, metadata helps you get to find cats that look like actors or whatever the cat thing is going on these days out there. So metadata really serves as the connecting thread that unifies various data assets across an organization, so it's very key there. And as AI evolves at a rapid pace, which many of us have encountered in the last couple of years, metadata is the high quality diet that helps these algorithms achieve optimal performance. And just to quote a Turing Award winner, Dr. Michael Stonebracher, AI and metadata are two sides of the same coin. While metadata provides the context, AI provides the capability to use it effectively. Next slide. So like any topic and anything you do in the policy or legislative realm, there's always challenges and benefits that relate to that particular topic, and there's good things to explore. So here, metadata really, you can see them on the slide, both sides. So metadata really enhances the searchability and improves data organization and facilitates that data management, and we kind of briefly talked about when we talked about metadata there. Of course, like any asset, you need to keep that quality and consistency high, and you need some folks to follow the bouncing ball, hence standardization. And you also want to ensure that your privacy and security protocols are maintained. That helps with that integration between users and the data. Metadata really plays a pivotal role in enhancing the overall effectiveness of open data portals by improving discoverability, supporting interoperability, and if you talk about metadata, you're going to use the term interoperability more than you're probably going to say metadata at the end of the day, and providing essential content for users to understand and use the available assets that they have in maybe their data catalog or what have you.
Okay, so now moving on to the timing of everything. So you know that we embarked on projects. Dean hinted a little bit at sort of the timing of his work, but for the Government of Canada, Really, there was an ongoing information management policy refresh underway. So we actually did have a standard on metadata in place since 2010 within the Government of Canada. And it had been issued under a policy on information management and was very much designed to support information management goals, which is great, which is, extremely valuable. However, the world was changing, digital transformation was well underway, and in 2020, the Government of Canada introduced the Policy on Service in Digital, which brought together rules for the management of information with those for managing cybersecurity, IT, service, and of course, data. And so now what you find is that you have this integrated set of rules for managing all of those aspects of government operations and assets. And that led to the rescission of the policy on information management and the movement of a lot of the requirements, the good requirements that had been within that policy regime underneath the policy on service in digital. However, there were a few, leftover policy instruments, and the standard on metadata ended up being moved without change under the policy on service in digital suite. And so that required, like other legacy policy instruments that had likewise been moved under the policy on service in digital without change, it begged for review to make sure that it could still effectively achieve the outcomes of that new policy and integrated look at all of these rules for managing information, data, IT, cybersecurity, and service, and as well, did the requirements that were in place under those legacy instruments still serve to achieve the expected results of this new policy work? And so really that's what led us in the spring of 2022 to take a new look at the 2010 standard on metadata. And what was great about this exercise is that my team was told that everything was on the table. I mean, we were allowed to consider just a basic update to the existing requirements. I cringe when I say this, but maybe just adding data to each of the requirements and calling it a day. Or we could dream bigger and we could consider actually introducing a refreshed policy instrument or even a new type of instrument beyond a standard. So that was great because all options were out there. But there were also bigger factors at play. We needed to ensure that whatever metadata policy direction that we set for the Government of Canada would be able to fully support digital transformation and would position us to be able to derive the most value from the information and data, government information and data that we had. So, looking at some bigger initiatives and commitments that, were being made publicly by the Government of Canada, we had to consider, with our whatever policy instrument we brought forward, whether it be the existing standard or some other instrument, would it enable us to build in data by design, enable data-driven services or data-informed decision-making? Would it allow us to sort of seize the full potential of modern and secure digital technologies? Would it allow us to truly put the safeguards in place to use or reuse those resources appropriately? And this is where, again, to reiterate what Dean has already said, metadata is really what breathes life into digital objects and turns them into information and data assets. And so, we knew that moving forward, that we had to take this metadata, this exercise of looking at our metadata policy direction and serve bigger needs. And as well, and unfortunately, this is what I was afraid would happen, is that the formatting would be off the day of the presentation, and we had some formatting issues sending it in. But at the bottom of the screen, what you can't see is sort of a highlight of some of the digital standards that we are expected to reflect and abide by in our work. And, a part of that is to be good data stewards. So we had to, use our policy direction to position us to do just that, and to work in the open by default. But also, another digital standard is to design with users. So, in the way that we carried this work forward, to design it with users, and likewise demonstrate working in the open by default. And so this brought us back to the standard on metadata from 2010. We had to take a closer look at it. And right away, there were some policy gaps that stood out, some challenges that we knew that we would face if we simply just dusted it off and called it a day. So right away, it was very much designed with information resources in mind. There's no mention of data in that particular policy. And so really there was this bias towards information and unstructured data, if you will, versus structured data. As well, it really spoke directly to departments, telling them, standardize your metadata, use metadata standards, but there wasn't a bigger enterprise view. And so that's great if you have all of these, silos sort of working and consistently describing their information and data. But ultimately, how does the government of Canada, create single windows to access, for example, or, design services digitally from end to end if you have a bunch of departments sort of working independently and doing things great on their own, but not necessarily being able to exchange or work together and facilitate federated search across their information and data assets. Also, the standard from 2010 very clearly promoted resource discoverability. So it's not that any of these, requirements were bad. The focus was great. It was about, focusing on web content management, web resource discovery, all great things, but it was to the exclusion of other needs. And another thing that really became clear is that the focus was on human readability. Again, a noble goal, something great to strive for, but it really didn't take into account machine readability and building in requirements that could effectively address that. So, we knew that basically we had to pursue a full-on policy refresh. We couldn't just take what we had and work with it. This was going to perhaps starting from scratch. And so, at the end of the day, the standard is now 13 years old. It was 12 years old at the time that we started this work. And we really needed to update the rules in order to be able to realize the expected results of digital government. So I've already talked about how limited the scope was of the existing standard. And the benefits to gain, again, Dean sort of highlighted them, they're all the same. We stood to gain a lot more by taking the time to sort of update this policy and work on those requirements than staying with the status quo. And consultations, that's the next section. I will get into the consultations we undertook to sort of support this conclusion. But overall, the consultations that we completed over the last year and a half overwhelmingly showed that the standard on metadata was not going to meet our needs going forward.
Thanks. So you heard Canada's kind of why, now the BC why. Well, first of all, we did not have a standard. We do and still do have an Information Management Act that includes data as government information, so trying to manage that data is part of that legislation package. Additionally, there was a variety of projects going on. Again, this is going back to 2017, 2018, just to set the timeline there. It's not current day. That were really building on our digital transformation at the time, and our BC digital plan was kind of under development back then. Of course, other jurisdictions had some standardization already, like Canada. So we needed to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. So we need to have our own standard here in BC. And developing a standard would, and I mentioned this briefly before, help to improve data quality and connectivity across government, which was a key goal. Next slide. Thank you. So a few of the key drivers in support of the standard, just to echo off of the Information Management Act there. So legislation and policy, obviously. We want government information to be reliable and trustworthy. Information sharing and that word interoperability, I might get you all to say it in unison by the time we finish this presentation. The standard would be a key enabler for open information exchange, system migrations, and the maintenance of our information and data in the BC government. And findable information, this was kind of a bigger driver as well. Standardized metadata helps facilitate specific searches across categories of data, and this really helps to support like freedom of information requests and to reduce the resource and time it takes to do those requests. Not sure if you're aware, BC government has one of the highest amount of requests for information requests in Canada. And as well, obviously supporting our digital transformation at the time, as I mentioned, as we move forward.
All right, so now, to me, this is the fun part of the presentation, and I'm hoping I can get my notes up here so I can share with you some of the stats that we have, but if not, that's okay. So how we did it in the Government of Canada. Again, we have the digital standard that says that we need to design with users and we need to work in the open by default. And so right from the start, we committed to developing this policy openly and transparently. And I can't stress enough how instrumental user feedback was to developing the policy that we did and taking the direction that we did. And so this, I mean, it's all captured on, in a few symbols, images on this slide. But this, what you see is a summary of an incredible amount of work and back and forth interactions over the course of more than a year. We completed a broad range of consultations, which I'll detail further in this section. But in the end, the consultations that we held generated over 1,400 unique comments from Government of Canada employees across the board, and we were able to reach 77 unique departments. We tried to reach them all, but this is who we actually know that we heard from the data that we gathered on those participants in our consultations. So we really kicked things fully off with a metadata symposium in May of 2022. And that was just, it was a symposium where there were 4 guest speakers from outside of the public service and within the federal public service who came and spoke to whoever wanted to listen across the Government of Canada about topics related to metadata. And this was really just to get the gears grinding, to get everyone thinking about metadata and start to provide to us feedback on where they wanted, what were some major challenges, what do we need to take into consideration in bringing our metadata policy forward. So that was, I would call it was more of, information being pushed outward to an audience, but it did garner some feedback. And then in between what you see on the screen, the Metadata Symposium and this Standard on Metadata Review subgroup that we brought together was, a literature review and environmental scanning work where our team was doing research behind the scenes, trying to, understand the lay of the land, who else could we talk to. But while we were doing that, we put out a broad call basically to try and bring together subject matter experts, primarily in the area of information and data management, to help us do literally a line-by-line review of the requirements of the standard on metadata. And so what the second image really represents is 5 weeks worth of intensive meetings, 2-hour meetings each week, where we sectioned off portions of the standard and sat in a room together. There were 90 subject matter experts that were brought together for that group, representing 29 different departments and agencies across government. And through live discussion and through collaboration on a collaboration platform, scrutinized every one of those requirements to see, what had merit, what were the pitfalls of it, and was it basically keep, modify, or delete going forward. And we also gave them an opportunity as well to give feedback on the policy direction that they felt that we needed to take. So it wasn't just limited to discussing the existing standard, but also, okay, you're here, we have experts around the table, tell us how to carry this forward. And then from there, we brought members of a smaller group of members from that group to actually roll up their sleeves and alongside myself and other members of my team, do a quick and dirty draft of a new standard that I think it took 2.5, 3 weeks. We sat down, we wrote it, and then in whatever form it was in, we put it out there for consultation. And basically every channel that we could identify, the GC data community, different communities of practice outside of the information management and data management communities. Basically, anyone who wanted to read it and had something to say and wanted to offer up an opinion was invited to give feedback on this consultation draft of the standard. Again, so that consultation happened over February and March earlier this year. There was another consultation held in the summer. Again, I'll get into the details in just a moment. And then we actually, with where we landed in terms of our final policy products, went to some departmental contacts and actually asked them to test them out, to try and read them, use them, and figure out, was this useful, give us some feedback. But again, all of these consultations, not to repeat myself, but it just kept, reconfirming for us that we needed to take a new direction with respect to the policy. Okay, so, so another thing that we did in terms of how the methodology we used is we took a user-centered approach to this policy development exercise right from the start. And really what we did is we borrowed completely from the user experience design world, and we developed user personas. We did this first just as our little team within Treasury Board of Canada's Secretariat, but we ultimately came up with the 4 user personas you see from left to right, right up to Akira. And basically, if you're not familiar with user personas, they're meant to kind of segment off, groups of users that have that share common interests, common pain points and challenges, and try to sort of define them through an archetypal type user profile. And so that's what you see on the screen here. We validated these through our the group of subject matter experts that we brought together. They needed some tweaks, so we kept working on them. And actually, we ended up with a 5th user because we were reminded that, I'm not sure if this is, respects sort of user experience design, the technique, but we were told to introduce the machine because we had to also think about, machine readability and basically take into account how metadata had to help, input data into other processes and systems. Beyond that, so we went into our consultations equipped with those users, constantly taking any feedback that we received and walking back and trying to walk through each of those users' shoes and thinking, okay, well, if we introduce this requirement, how will it be received by user 1 or user 2? If I am an IM professional, this speaks really great, to that person, but if I'm someone behind the scenes who's configuring a system, does this work for me? So it was really helpful to kind of go into this experience with those user profiles in mind to take us, to help us walk through the experience of someone that we, whose experience we might not immediately share. Beyond that, we also really sought to approach a broad range of stakeholders. So, we used every means possible. We again, beyond the information and data management communities, we sought out representation from employment equity, diversity, and inclusion groups. We spoke to folks that represent, Government of Canada security and cybersecurity, IT professionals. I mean, you name it, we went out there and we tried to, have this on their radar and get their perspectives heard so we could take that into account moving forward. And what's really interesting is we found that actually 1 in 3 respondents of our consultation worked outside of the field of information data, which is, I consider that a win. You can just see the 3rd bullet point kind of outlines some of the different professionals that we had participate in this consultation. And the way that we did this, a lot of it was old school, basically, targeted emails to policy centers, to different stakeholders, put out broad, mass calls for expressions of interest in participating in the consultation, and, forums like this, where we went and we got on the agenda of meetings and were able to speak directly and answer questions directly of different communities and communities of practice. No, it's not working again. Can I? Sorry. I'm not sure why the... Is it not working here? No, we just need...
Go to the pad. Just on here. You can just tap this. Right.
Okay, perfect.
There you go.
Thank you. Sorry. Finally, this is what I think is the most exciting part of our consultation process is we did solicit feedback every step of the way, and two ways that we did so that I think were really exciting were having live sessions, so it was basically, we would have an hour and a half. It was a broad call put out. You never knew what mixture of participants, representatives, stakeholders you were going to get around the table. They were held virtually. And it was, me talking for 10 minutes, presenting the project, and then basically, we sat back, we listened, and participants were invited to, ask questions, provide their input live if they weren't comfortable doing so through a questionnaire that we also made available so that participants could provide their feedback in written form. But beyond that, this summer, so we took the feedback that we received, and what resulted was actually a fuller product suite. So it wasn't just one policy instrument, but a policy package. So after the first round of consultations, we knew that that's where we needed to go. We drafted that, and then we actually posted those drafts in a collaboration space, and we basically invited live edits. We crowdsourced feedback, and you can see the statistics on the screen of the level of engagement that yielded, and the amount of comments and revision suggestions that we received. We also asked about the consultation process itself, and it predominantly got positive feedback. Timing issues aside, I think for the most part, it was appreciated that we had opened it up and put ourselves out there and let people speak for themselves and not put ourselves in as intermediaries to try and interpret their feedback.
Thank you. So as Marissa explained there, their journey quite a bit different than our journey in BC. They were iterating on a previous standard. We were developing a new one. Again, I want to just time set this. This is like 2018, 2019, so they're doing some stuff in 2023. Just a little caveat there, it's good not to jump. If you're buying new tech or a new product, it's sometimes good to wait to see what Apple, the new latest edition, is going to do before you jump and buy it. So, that was beneficial to us here in BC. We were able to look at Canada and other jurisdictions to see what they had done in the metadata world. And because this was our first take on this standard, we needed to learn and review and really understand what we're trying to achieve here and what we're trying to accomplish, and really what the problem was in BC in general, and what the best approach was to resolving that problem. So I reached out to a few experts I had found in metadata within the BC government. One particular expert was nearing retirement, and if you ever had a chance to talk to a nearing retirement public servant, it's always a good idea. You get a really straightforward, honest answer and impression of what they think about various things. It was very helpful to have those conversations with him. He'd actually developed a bit of a standard a couple of years before I even heard about metadata. I just didn't have the traction at the time to move forward. And another expert that I spoke with and I touched base with really was focusing on the educational piece of metadata in BC government. He felt that really the goal of the project would be just to have folks understand what metadata was, and if we ever developed a standard, that was really kind of icing on the cake. So as I started this project, I really leaned into agile methodology, I started this project before we really leaned into agile methodologies. That was, not sure if you caught the lean and agile in the same sentence. That was supposed to be kind of a funny joke. It was when I wrote it. My team didn't think it was funny either, so you're all in good company there. So I did follow a bit of a hybrid waterfall agile process. I interviewed several data records, information management colleagues. I really tried to gather a solid working group together. So I wanted a really diverse group of folks to really tackle this and see it from all sides. From this great working group that I put together, about 15 individuals from like 4 different kind of disciplines, was the first lesson I kind of learned in this development process. is that I needed to really establish and negotiate some of those relationships. And by that I mean, if you've ever worked with some data, information management, and records folks, they won, and no disrespect, they're all awesome people and they was great to work with, but they focus on their own perspective often when you're in a working group setting. They have different interpretations of terminology. I know Marissa touched on that a little bit earlier. And at this point, again, this is a few years back, they had not really all sat together in one room together dealing with those first 2 points that I mentioned. So I really spent a lot of time managing a lot of and maintaining a lot of positive relationships as we moved through the various barriers that each kind of discipline raised, and really supported that cross-functional education. I will say my mediation training served me well through those times, but I will say the benefit moving forward, those relationships and that kind of coming together moments with that working group, other instruments and other products that I worked on, even just as recently as last year, that speed of trust was really built from those relationships and those times spending in a room, really kind of hammering out what we wanted that standard to look like and what we're really trying to achieve. So, sometimes, a little pain gives you a little gain, so to speak. Next slide, please. So what we heard, not as deep a consultation as Canada did when they were doing their iterations, but a little bit consultation nonetheless. 57 comments on 12 business areas isn't really a lot when you come to a standard, and a lot of those folks were technically in the room when we were doing it. There's kind of 3 main needs that emerged through that consultation engagement process. One was the need for flexibility. So a lot of folks felt they had other legacy metadata. They didn't want to be pigeonholed into certain elements and have to spend a lot of time and resources to make it match, so to speak. They really wanted a flexible approach. Guidelines, if you ever developed a standard, it's nice to publish a standard, but people like to know what that standard does and how to implement it. So that was really something we resonated from folks, with some guidelines on how, that's nice you have a standard, but how does this really work? And then consistency was probably the biggest item in the room that in engagement and consultations that we had. Being consistent in the data and how it was going to be used, to help reduce time and save some resources, particularly when a lot of folks were doing like creating crosswalks or aliases, which are basically trying to match data to data when you're going to go use it and share it. So people have to make sure that things jive, and people have to spend time to do that. And if we have consistency, that reduces that as well. Next slide. So I probably could have started with this slide earlier just to kind of level set the time, just because I am talking a bit in the past, but this is kind of a snapshot from beginning to end. So 2018 is kind of when the request started, and then in 2022 the guidelines were approved and launched, taking account that there was a bit of COVID in there that kind of interrupted the whole flow at the end of the day, but that's kind of the nice little timeline of how it took us to develop the standard at the end of the day.
Okay, so we've sort of outlined where we started, what the motivations were, the impetus behind the different projects we undertook, and how we each, the methodologies that we each employed in order to end up somewhere. But what did we end up with? Well, before I'll get into that, I think it's important to emphasize that we really made an attempt to respond to what we heard. Sure, we went into this with some hypotheses, with some, ideas of our own, some preconceived notions of where we would land in terms of a policy instrument and what those requirements would look like. But I can tell you that the draft that we put out for consultation in February and March looks remarkably different from what we ended up with at the end of the day. And so one thing that we did is we kind of took up the direction, and rather than focusing on metadata standardization just in and of itself, we responded to the need to provide for comprehensive metadata management. And so that's one of the first major changes between the existing standard and the new one, is that, the consultations really confirmed for us that this is considered important to departments, and that metadata is a type of data that needs to be actively managed, and that you have to speak to that sort of overall practice first before you can get into the nitty-gritty of the standards that are used themselves. The next thing that we heard was that there was a need for a broadened scope and flexibility. So moving towards, scoping and metadata management more broadly partly address this. But as well, kind of, similar to what Dean just described, there were departments successfully applying metadata standards and using them, and they're critical to being able to, for them to continue working with their partners, with their stakeholders. And so we wanted to provide space for metadata standards that are well established and working to continue to function that way, but also encourage, those pockets where metadata maybe wasn't being standardized and managed all that well, to sort of put in, stronger parameters and make sure that we still set rules that everyone was going to move forward with common rules of engagement with respect to metadata. Again, much like with the government of BC, there was an overwhelming call for implementation guidance. Sure, give us the rules, give us the requirements, but those requirements can be interpreted in multiple different ways. And so to make sure that we removed any ambiguity with regards to what was being asked and what compliance looked like, right away we developed some guidance pieces to support the implementation of our new policy instrument. And finally, there was a call for the need for a clear governance path. And I'll get into this more with my next slide. But basically, what we ended up with was a standard for managing metadata. That's the new title that's put forth. And it falls under the larger umbrella of our directive on service and digital. And so basically we wanted to build off of rules that were already set higher up in the policy hierarchy, but make sure that, governance over metadata specifically was clear, and that if departments wanted to move forward in a certain direction, they understood the governance path for doing so, specifically for metadata. And so here we are. So the standard for managing metadata is the main mandatory policy piece that we're putting in place to replace the 2010 standard on metadata. And really what underpins our approach to this policy is the perspective that the open and strategic management of information and data inherently requires that metadata also be managed. And the reason why that's important is because the policy and the directive on service and digital under which this sits, neither of them actually explicitly address metadata. And so we wanted to respect sort of the integrity of our policy hierarchy. We wanted to move forward without, redundancy, without duplication of requirements, and make sure that, departmental officials in going into interpreting those policy pieces, whenever they saw, requirements for the open and strategic management of information and data, would by default think, and this includes metadata, and this includes also thinking about the metadata. However, even with that mindset and that approach, we still found that there were a few policy gaps that we had to fill, and so that's what we targeted with our final standard for managing metadata. And and if you saw it now, there's really just 4 requirements. It's very holistic in its approach. It's overarching and provides high-level policy direction overall for managing metadata, and again, focusing in just on the gaps otherwise left by the overall policy suite. And this is sort of just a little snapshot of the pieces that you'll see in this product suite. So at the top is the standard for managing metadata, and that is compliance for that is mandatory. And it really only has 4 requirements that focus on what's addressed by the guidance pieces that you see in the boxes that kind of make up the rest of the star on the screen. And so, what we found is that there needed to be increased attention about considering metadata needs up front and building that into the design and delivery of services. So we actually, with the assistance of those that we consulted and examples that we had to follow, built out a guide on assessing metadata needs that really it's, and these are optional but highly recommended compliance pieces. And we did that intentionally so that we could keep them evergreen, we could evolve them and more easily update and change them as we started to understand implementation needs better through application. And as well, we have a guidance on prescribing metadata reference standards. So again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to carry forward what's been working, metadata standards that are already endorsed, promoted through existing policies, or even under the standard on metadata, which we will eventually rescind. But we just wanted to formalize the process to kind of rubber stamp it again and say, yes, we are just reaffirming that this is the standard for the Government of Canada with respect to this type of metadata. But we also recognize that not all metadata standards are appropriate for application across all of the GC. And so really what the requirement says and what this guidance outlines is direction for departments where there isn't a pre-existing prescribed Government of Canada enterprise metadata reference standard. You must then, through your own, through a process to be determined by your department, declare then what your departmental standard is for the other types of metadata that you put in place. We also offer guidance on metadata lifecycle management because, again, with this standard that is currently in the approvals process right now, we're putting it forward and it's going to have a go-forward approach. Okay, that's great, but who has nothing existing? Who is starting from scratch and can, make the landscape perfect going forward? We know that obviously there's pre-existing situations and a context that has to be dealt with. And so really the guidance on metadata lifecycle management reinforces that view that metadata is its own data that has its own life cycle, and you can place yourself in where you're at in terms of the life cycles of the metadata that is currently being managed by your organization. And finally, the standard for managing metadata speaks directly to the need to ensure metadata quality. Data quality is important, and especially as we're relying on data and data assets to feed into automated decision-making systems or looking at generative AI, you want to be able to trust that data, and metadata is really instrumental in helping to provide those attributes that let you know that, yes, this is fit for my purpose, I can trust this data. And so we needed to declare that you also have to make sure that your metadata meets a certain quality standard. And so we have this more general guidance on data quality that will be issued for all data for the Government of Canada, but equally applies to this. And then just to supplement this suite, of course, what will emerge is a formal inventory of prescribed Government of Canada enterprise metadata reference standards to be applied equally and commonly across all of the Government of Canada. We will offer sort of more informally best practices we have an internal Government of Canada IM toolkit that's made available internally to federal public servants. And as well, we want to build out metadata playbooks because, again, going back to those user personas that we created to help us walk through this policy development exercise, we realize that there are different journeys that need to be mapped. There are different experiences and scenarios that those who will action the implementation of this policy instrument will need to think through, and so we actually want to have playbooks that help you walk through those practical situations.
Thank you. Yeah, just noting the time and try not to keep you between there and lunch. I see 5-minute warning there. I'll try to go a little fast as I can. So this is kind of what our metadata standard looks like. Obviously, you can find it online. It looks much prettier in some sort of standardized template and guidance document. Since it was our first kick at this can, so to speak, we wanted to keep it short and sweet and make sure it was usable and achievable with an emphasis on guidance and support that education that I mentioned that came out of the consultation. The elements selected there, the 9 elements you see there, are based on Dublin Core Standard ISO 15836. Hopefully that's still the same number for that particular standard. We really wanted to focus a lot of the elements on automated metadata, so you see a lot of those in Microsoft applications and databases, so that there was less manual entry, so to speak. And the really consistency and flexible gem to our standard is the application profile. So metadata application profiles or maps, they help define the metadata for a business area and provide business rules, guidance, and best practices for use. So essentially, a business area can adopt by default those 9 core elements and they're good for their map, but if they have specific needs for their area, they can expand on that map, including those 9 core areas and provide some definition and documentation related to how they're using those. And then obviously the guidelines there really helps expand folks' understanding of what those core elements are and what they apply to, and helps tell you how to go about creating a map, which is obviously important. And then also provide some questions and examples to kind of go through and support each of those metadata elements that you're doing, and provide some context on how to implement as well. Am I going next, or are you going next?
You can go. And I lost, did I go too far? Oh. There we go. We can, so this brings us to, so where does this leave us? Again, as I mentioned during the last segment of this presentation, we have put forth the standard for managing metadata and the supplementary guidance instruments to support its application forward for approvals. It's currently like very much at the last stages of approvals. But you know, in terms of lessons learned, I think this is where we're going to sort of share, lessons that we learned throughout the process. But I can tell you that I found, the development of user profiles and trying to step outside of my sphere of, knowledge and familiarity with metadata extremely valuable, and it's actually changed some of the decisions I think that I made or that my team made in terms of the policy direction that we took and where we finally landed. Another thing that I think was really reinforced is that you need standards. As much as you want to respect user behavior, you want to reduce user burden, alleviate it altogether if you can, and maximize opportunities to basically eliminate human intervention if that's appropriate. That's great, but you still, as much as you want to, meet users in a way that makes sense to them, you do need standardization, and you do have to have some rules in place, because some level of consistency or facilitating interpretation between different vocabularies that users use is it's integral in order for things to be interoperable.
There's that word, interoperable. So just echoing what Marissa said there, obviously rules are important, and consistency and consistent behavior is key. Some of the lessons learned, just to touch base on, that you've probably heard, just to kind of wrap it up, is engage early and often. Engage early and often, very agile-like, so there's that, and do some user testing and those personas that Canada expressed. That's kind of future where we will go into the BC government as well. I do want to touch on that the standard has become a foundational ingredient to the BC data catalog and the recently approved BC data management policy. And it's all part of that suite, kind of what Marissa touched on with Canada, a policy suite working together as a coordinated effort towards digital transformation and consistency and setting up some rules. To tie it back to the conference briefly, and I touched on this earlier, so metadata is really a key component of open data, and it helps to support that discoverability, the understandability, the interoperability, and the reusability of data. The key word there is ability with metadata. Metadata helps you do some ability things. And I just want to leave one last note, and there is a bit of a bad pun in here since no one got the first one, maybe you can catch this one. With data as the currency of the day, an effective metadata standard assists to keep your account flush. A good thing to keep in mind as we all head down this road, this AI road. So metadata is key for AI. Thank you. I don't know if questions. That's good. I don't know if we have time for questions, or maybe we planned that very well, so there was no questions.
When we did the dry run, we only hit 45 minutes, so I guess we must have added some stuff. But
is there any question? Do anybody have any questions that we may be able to answer? Awesome. I like that. Thank you very much for coming. And thanks to Marissa for helping. She was kind of tagged, and I got tagged, and we worked together, so it was really awesome to meet her, and she's done great work here. I really appreciate working with you, and that's thank you.
Same, thank
you. Yeah.